The marriage had ended in November, officially, legally, with signed papers and a mediator who wore lavender sweaters and spoke in the measured tones of someone professionally accustomed to human wreckage. Claire and I had been together for 6 years, married for 3, and the unraveling had been so gradual that by the time we sat across from each other in that mediator's office, we were both mostly just tired. The grief had already happened, in slow motion over the preceding 18 months. Moved into a studio apartment in Asheville that smelled of someone else's. Cooking and spent November and December doing the things you do. When a chapter ends, filing paperwork, redistributing furniture, telling people who needed to know. I was not dramatic about it. I was, if anything, too functional, which is its own kind of problem. Because functionality has a way of deferring pain rather than processing it. And deferred pain has a way of accumulating interest. By January, I was efficient and hollow, and could not sleep past 4 in the morning. I'd lie in my studio apartment, listening to the city, and feeling the absence of everything that used to constitute my life. And I'd make lists in my head of things I needed to do. Which is what I did instead of feeling things. A colleague named Brent, who'd been through his own divorce 3 years earlier, told me I needed to do something physical and alone. Not a gym, he said. Something with actual distance, where you put miles between yourself and everything familiar. He'd done a solo backpacking trip in the Smoky Mountains. Said it had rearranged something in him. I didn't want to be rearranged. I just wanted to sleep. But I booked a 3-day solo trail in the Pisgah National Forest anyway. Because Brent was usually right about things, and because I had run out of better ideas, I packed light. A quality tent. Sleeping bag rated 215 degrees, 3 days of food. 2 liters of water capacity, a headlamp, a paper trail map I'd printed from the Ranger Station website, a first aid kit, and a journal I told myself I'd write in but knew I probably wouldn't. I told 3 people where I was going, Brent. My sister Meg and my neighbor Carl, who had a spare key to my apartment. I left on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of February. The trailhead parking area was empty, except for a rusted green Subaru with North Carolina plates and a crack across its rear windshield. The air was sharp and smelled of dead leaves and coming snow. The forecast had mentioned a possibility of light flurries by Thursday, which was my last day, well within manageable range. I shouldered my pack, checked my compass, found north, and started walking. For the first 4 hours, it was exactly what I needed. The trail wound through second growth, hardwood forest, oak and hickory, and the occasional sourwood, their branches bare and intricate against the white February sky. The ground was hard with cold, the frost not yet fully loosened by midday. My breath came in clouds. My legs worked. The thinking stopped, mostly replaced by the simple arithmetic of movement. Step, breath, step, breath, the angle of the slope, the texture of the ground beneath my boots. I found a good campsite by 3 in the afternoon. A flat shelf of ground above a creek, sheltered from the wind by a natural rock formation on one side and dense rhododendron on the other. I pitched my tent, boiled water, ate a freeze-dried meal that tasted better than it had any right to, and wrote exactly 1 sentence in my journal before putting it away. The sentence was, I came here to feel better, and so far, I just feel cold. I was in my sleeping bag by 8 o'clock. I fell asleep to the sound of the creek and woke at 4 in the morning, as reliably as I always did. I lay still in the dark, watching the tent fabric, listening. Wind in the trees, the creek, an owl somewhere distant, and then between the owl and the next gust of wind. In a silence that lasted maybe 3 seconds, a sound I couldn't immediately categorize. Not an animal sound, not wind. Something more deliberate. The specific, careful quality of a footstep placed very slowly. I held my breath. Nothing. Wind, creek, owl. I told myself it was a deer. I told myself the cold was making branches settle oddly. I told myself that being alone in the wilderness at 4 in the morning was statistically and actually very safe, and that my nervous system was just unaccustomed to genuine quiet. I fell back asleep around 5. When I woke at 7, the world was gray-blue with early light and perfectly still. And I remembered the sound and decided it had been a deer and made coffee and started. My second day on the trail. The second day was harder. The trail climbed more aggressively, switchbacking up a ridge that the map labeled Harrow's Spine, an ominous name I'd noticed when planning the route and dismissed as mere local color. Now, laboring up its steep pitch with my lungs pulling cold air, I wondered which early surveyor had chosen the name and what they'd experienced to prompt it. By mid-morning, I'd gained nearly 1,000 feet of elevation and stopped at a rocky outcrop to rest and eat trail mix and take in the view. A rolling sea of bare winter ridges extending south and west. The sky enormous and low and the color of old pewter. Snow coming for certain. I rechecked the forecast in my head. It had said light flurries Thursday. Today being Wednesday, and decided I had ample margin. I was wrong about that. But that revelation came later. It was on the descent from Harrow's Spine around early afternoon that I saw the eyes for the first time. The trail moved through a dense section of eastern hemlock old growth. The trunks enormous, their branches interlocking overhead in a canopy so thick it turned the light green-gray even in winter. The ground beneath them was carpeted in rust-colored needles so thick they muffled sound, and the effect was of moving through a cathedral. Hushed and closed and slightly outside ordinary time. I had slowed down because the ground was slick with frost under the needles and I was being careful. My attention was on my feet. So I almost missed it. Almost what made me look up was the feeling. The one you know instinctively, that lived in every human nervous system long before we had words for it. The feeling of being observed. It's a real sensation, researchers have documented it. A subconscious integration of peripheral visual cues and environmental microsounds that the brain processes into a pre-verbal alarm. You are not imagining it when you feel it. Your body is telling you something your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. I looked up from the trail between two enormous hemlock trunks. At a distance of perhaps 40 feet, the dense shadow of the canopy where the light barely reached a pair of eyes, not animal eyes. Not the reflective shine of a deer or a bear caught in peripheral light. These were steady and fixed and at a height consistent with a standing human figure. They didn't reflect the light the way animal eyes do. They simply existed in the shadow, watching me with an attention so focused it felt almost physical. I stopped walking. The eyes didn't move. My heart did a slow, nauseating drop into my stomach. I stood absolutely still on the frost-slick trail and stared at the space between those two hemlocks and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Tried to resolve it into something ordinary. A hiker, a hunter, a trick of shadow and ambient light. But the light wasn't playing tricks. I could see them clearly. 2 points of faint luminescence in the deep shadow between the trees, spaced correctly for a face, at exactly the height a standing person's eyes would be, watching me. Double quotes, hello. I said. My voice came out steady, which surprised me. Is someone there? Nothing. No movement. No response. I took one careful step toward the trees. The eyes didn't widen or blink or shift, none of the reflexive responses a person makes when approached. They simply remained. Present and steady and patient in a way that felt wrong in a register I couldn't define. I stopped walking toward them. A gust of wind moved through the hemlocks overhead, and in the 3 or 4 seconds that the branches shook and the light shifted, the eyes were gone. The shadow between the two trunks was just shadow, needles and bark in winter dark. I stood there breathing for a long moment. Then I turned back to the trail and kept moving, faster than before. My body had made a decision before my mind caught up, and my legs were already working hard. Putting distance between me and the hemlock grove, moving with the urgency of something that didn't want to be examined too closely, I set up camp early that night. Before 3 o'clock, in a clearing with wide sightlines in all directions, I told myself I was being prudent about the weather. I built a fire larger than I needed and ate without tasting my food and sat close to the flames until they burned to coals and the temperature dropped and I had no choice but to go inside the tent I lay awake a long time. I did not write in my journal. I didn't want to put it into words yet. The superstitious part of my brain believed that writing it down would make it more real than it already was. Instead, I listened. Wind, cold, the settling of branches. And once, very close to the edge of my campsite, a sound I recognized from the previous night. Slow, deliberate. The particular careful quality of a step placed very intentionally, as though whatever was making it was less concerned with speed than with silence. One step, and then nothing. I did not sleep until it was almost dawn. The snow came 12 hours early. I woke Thursday morning to a world completely transformed, 3 inches already on the ground, and more falling in the windless, vertical way that means it intends to accumulate. The temperature had dropped sharply overnight. The air now genuinely cold, rather than merely uncomfortable. And my water bottle had developed a skin of ice at the cap. I sat in my tent and conducted a rational assessment. I was 1 full day's hike from the trailhead, approximately 7 miles on a trail that was now partially obscured by snow and would become more so as the morning continued. My gear was adequate but not designed for prolonged winter conditions. I had food for 1 more day, plenty of water capacity once I melted snow, and a phone with 20% battery that had not had signal. Since the first afternoon, the rational decision was to break camp immediately and move toward the trailhead as efficiently as possible. I packed faster than I ever had in my life. The forest looked different under snow. The bare branches held white along their upper edges, creating a delicate doubling of every line. And the ground was uniformly pale and pristine, except where animals had already moved across it. I could see tracks, deer, certainly, and the paired prints of something smaller, rabbits or squirrels, and once crossing the trail ahead of me, a set of prints that stopped me in my tracks. Large, roughly human-shaped in outline, though not quite. The proportions were slightly off, too long in the toe region to narrow through the arch, and they came from the trees on the left side of the trail, crossed the path, and disappeared into the trees on the right side, recent enough that the snow had not yet begun to fill them, which meant they'd been made while I was breaking camp. While I was within hearing distance, I stood over them and felt the cold move through me in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Not bare. The shape was wrong, no claw marks, no round toe pads. Not deer, not any hoofed animal, not any track I recognized from the identification guides. I'd consulted when planning the trip, human-adjacent, the best description. I had. I looked at the tree line on both sides of the trail. The snow was still falling, steady and soft, and the forest had the profound silence of a heavily muffled world. Nothing moved. Nothing looked back at me from between the trees, or so I told myself. I moved fast. The trail was harder to follow under the snow. The blazes on the trees less obvious when your vision kept pulling to the tree line. Kept scanning the shadows between trunks for the points of light you couldn't stop expecting. I navigated by compass when the trail became ambiguous, triangulating against the map I'd folded into my jacket pocket. And I kept moving. I had covered perhaps 3 miles, roughly halfway to the trailhead, when the trail dipped into a ravine and crossed a creek on a log bridge that the snowmelt had made treacherous. I crossed slowly, 1 careful step at a time, poles planted for stability. Stopped on the far bank to check the map. That was when I saw it. Not just eyes this time, a shape, a silhouette, standing at the crest of the ravine bank on the far side of the creek, where I had just come from, motionless in the falling snow, tall, thin, proportioned like a person, and yet not quite. The limbs were too long, the posture too still. It stood among 3 bare-branched oaks, and the falling snow accumulated on its shoulders, on its head, and it did not move to shed it, did not move at all. Simply stood with a quality of patience, so complete it felt geological. Its face, if it had a face, was in shadow under the canopy. Even though there was no canopy, just open sky and falling snow, the shadow clung to the upper portion of its form the way shadows don't in nature. The way they only exist in the dark places we create inside our own minds. and in that shadow, 2 points of pale, steady light, watching me. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because this story isn't worth telling if I'm not honest. What I felt was not the clean, activating fear of a threat, you understand. It was something older and deeper and more disorienting, the fear you feel when you encounter something that is outside the boundaries of your established model of reality. When the world reveals that it contains things it never mentioned to you. My legs were already moving. My pack jounced against my back. The trail climbed out of the ravine on my side, and I climbed with it, not looking back, not making a sound, moving with the single-minded urgency of every animal that has ever needed to not be where it was. I did not look back. I told myself that. I looked back once. From the top of the ravine, before the trail curved behind a stand of pine and the ravine dropped out of sight, the far bank was empty. The 3 oaks stood bare and snow-covered and alone. Whatever had been standing among them was gone, or it had moved into the trees, which was once somehow worse. I want to say I moved calmly and efficiently from that point. I want to present myself as the kind of person who processes terror into tactical competence. The truth is, I moved in a controlled panic, which is its own particular state, faster than is strictly safe. My attention split between the trail ahead and the tree line on all sides, my breathing loud in my ears, my rational mind running dialogue that went roughly. It was a person. Hikers use this trail. It was a hunter. Hunters work these ridges. There is a perfectly ordinary explanation. Keep moving. My emotional mind said nothing. It was too busy flooding my bloodstream with adrenaline. The snow kept falling. By mid-afternoon, it was 4 inches deep on the level ground and deeper in the hollows. And the trail had become largely a matter of faith and compass-bearing. I moved through sections of forest that felt completely trackless, following the memory of the map, looking for blazes on trees, and finding them. Trusting the bearing when I couldn't, and all the while in my peripheral vision movement, just at the edge of perception, the particular kind of movement that stops when you look at it directly. It's the way certain stars are only visible when you look slightly away from them. Present in the corners of your vision and absent at the center. I couldn't confirm it. I couldn't deny it. I kept moving. Around 4 in the afternoon. With the light beginning its winter retreat and my legs burning and my water running low, I made a decision I immediately knew was wrong. I cut off the trail to take what the map suggested was a more direct line to the parking area, through a section of open hardwood forest that looked straightforward on paper, in 3 inches of snow, in fading light. With an imperfect map and a compass, I trusted, but not infallibly, it was not straightforward. I walked for 40 minutes and came out at a creek I didn't recognize. Not the creek I was looking for. The light was nearly gone. The snow was still falling. I was lost. I sat down on a snow-covered log and took 10 deliberate breaths and did not allow myself to panic in the way that loses people in wilderness situations. The spiral of desperation that makes you move without direction, burning energy and safety margin at once. I had my headlamp. I had shelter. I had food for 1 more day. I could make camp, survive the night. And in the morning light I could reorient. What I could not do, what I absolutely could not do, was spend the night in the open with whatever was moving through these trees. I found a sheltered spot between 2 massive downed trees, their root balls creating a natural windbreak, and set up my tent with hands that were clumsy from cold and something else. I worked methodically, going through the motions of camp setup that muscle memory made automatic. Trying not to look at the tree line, failing not to look at the tree line, the shadows between the trees were very deep. The snow gave everything a pale, sourceless luminescence that paradoxically made the darkness between the trunks darker by contrast. I saw nothing. Nothing saw me, or I saw nothing I could confirm. I was inside the tent by the time the last light failed, and I lay in my sleeping bag fully dressed, boots still on, headlamp on my forehead, listening to the forest with an attention I had never before applied to listening. Every sound catalogued, every sound assessed wind, snow falling from overloaded branches in soft collisions. The creek muffled, an owl to owls, trading calls across distance. And then, close, very close, no more than 20 feet from the tent. The sound of something standing still, not movement, stillness. There is a sound to stillness when it is active rather than passive, when it is the stillness of a thing that has stopped, moving rather than a thing that never moved. A quality of held breath, of presence. I lay rigid in my sleeping bag with my headlamp off and my heart doing terrible things in my chest. "I know you're there," I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. Silence. "I'm not going to come out," I said. "And I'm asking you, whatever you are, to leave me alone." A long, absolute silence. And then, so quiet I wasn't certain I'd heard it, so brief it might have been the wind, a sound. Not a word. Not quite. More like the shape of language without its content. The way someone's voice sounds when you hear it. Through a wall, and can identify the rhythm, but not the meaning. Then nothing. The owl. The snow. The creek. I did not sleep. When dawn came, gray and slow, and heavily muffled by cloud, I unzipped the tent and looked out with the careful caution of someone who has spent 8 hours listening to the dark. The snow around my campsite was unmarked in all directions. Whatever had been standing 20 feet from my tent had left no footprints, which was impossible, and which told me, in a language colder than the air, that I was dealing with something that did not leave marks in the world the way solid things do. Something that existed in the space between what the eye confirms and what the nervous system knows. I broke camp in silence. I found the trail by compass in under 30 minutes. I walked the remaining 3 miles to the trailhead without stopping. The ranger station at the trailhead was technically closed for the off-season, but a truck with county plates sat outside and a light burned behind the window. And I knocked on the door with the conviction of a man who needs to talk to another human being immediately. The woman who opened it was around 50. Compact and weathered, with the particular calm of someone who has spent decades in the field. Her name tag said, Calloway. She looked at me, my snow-crusted jacket, my pale face, my eyes that probably looked the way I felt, and stepped back without comment to let me inside. She made coffee. She sat across from me at a metal desk, covered in maps, and waited. I told her. All of it, including the parts that sounded unhinged, the eyes in the hemlock grove, the silhouette in the snow, the tracks, the sound outside the tent, the absence of footprints in the morning. I spoke for about 15 minutes, and she listened without interrupting, her expression professionally neutral. And when I finished, she wrapped her hands around her own coffee mug and was quiet for a moment. "Harrow's spine section," she said finally. "The hemlock grove on the eastern descent." She nodded slowly. "You're not the first?" I waited. "Over the past 12 years, since I've been stationed here, we've had," she paused, 14 separate reports from solo hikers in that section of trail. All roughly consistent with what you're describing. Eyes, silhouette, the sound at night. The missing footprints. She picked up her coffee. 9 of those hikers were experienced backcountry people, not prone to imagination. "What is it?" I asked, officially. She met my eyes. "Unknown. The Forest Service position is that these are misidentifications, unusual lighting, the psychological effects of prolonged solitude, confirmation bias once a person becomes anxious, classic explanations." And unofficially. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow had stopped. A strip of pale blue sky showed at the edge of the clouds. "The local Cherokee community has a name for what's in that section of the preserve," she said carefully. "It's not a name I'm going to repeat because it's not my tradition to share. But the concept translates roughly as the keeper of thresholds. Something that lives at the boundary between the forest and the human world. That watches. That assesses." She paused. "The traditional understanding is that it's not predatory. It's evaluative. It watches people to determine something, whether they belong in the wild space or whether they're taking what doesn't belong to them. I thought about that. About why I'd gone into those woods, hollow and functional and trying to metabolize grief in the cleanest, most efficient way possible, taking solitude as a resource without particularly honoring what solitude meant. And if it decides you don't belong? I asked. Of the 14 reports, Ranger Calloway said, setting down her mug, 13 people walked out with what you have now. Some lost sleep. A story they don't entirely know what to do with. And in most cases, something else. She looked at me steadily. Something shifted. Something they went in carrying that they came out without. Pause. The forest takes things sometimes. Not the bad things you'd expect. The things you were holding too tightly? I thought about Claire. About the signed papers and the lavender sweater and the 18 months of slow unraveling. About the thing I'd been carrying since November that was too big and too heavy and that I'd been trying to process into something manageable through sheer organizational efficiency. And the 14th person? I asked. Ranger Calloway looked out the window at the clearing sky. Didn't walk out at all. A long pause. Disappeared in 2019 in the same section. We searched for 11 days. She turned back to me. He was a man who'd gone in angry. Really angry. Not sad, not lost, genuinely furious at the world and looking for something to punish. She was quiet for a moment. Whatever's in those trees doesn't like fury, we think. Fury is loud. It crowds out listening. And that section of the forest is particular about listening. I sat with that for a long while. The coffee was very hot and very good. You want to know if you're okay? She said. You're okay, she said. You're tired and scared and you've been seen by something most people never encounter. But you walked out and that means something. She stood up and went to the window. Go home. Sleep. Give it time. She turned back with an expression that was equal parts pragmatic and kind. And if you go back into the woods, into any woods, go for the right reasons. That's all it wants, I think. People who come for the right reasons. I drove back to Asheville in a state that I can only describe as rinsed. Empty in the way a room is empty after everything has been moved out, the shape's still there. All the familiar walls and corners, but the accumulated weight of the contents gone. I called Brent from the road. Told him I'd made it out, that I was fine, that the snow had complicated things. Didn't mention the eyes. Didn't mention the silhouette. Didn't mention the night I'd spent rigid in my sleeping bag, listening to a presence that left no footprints. Some things don't translate well over the phone. I slept for 14 hours when I got home. This is remarkable because I had not slept more than 5 consecutive hours since November. Since the papers were signed and the chapter closed, I lay down at 6 in the evening, and the next thing. I knew it was 9 in the morning and light was coming through the window and I was lying exactly where I'd fallen. Perfectly still, as if something had held me there gently through the dark. I felt different. Not healed. Grief isn't a wound that closes cleanly, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But the quality of what I was carrying had changed. The density of it. The way it sat in my chest. Before the mountains, my grief had been a thing I managed. Filed, organized, addressed in the most efficient framework available. I had treated the end of my marriage the way I treated professional setbacks, as a problem requiring a solution protocol. As something to move through rather than experience. Now, lying in the February morning light of my studio apartment, I understood for the first time that I was sad. Genuinely, deeply, simply sad. Not about the failure, not about what went wrong or who bore what responsibility for what. Just sad that something I had loved was over. Sad the way a person is sad, not the way a project manager is sad. I cried for about 20 minutes. It was not elegant. It was exactly what it needed to be. When I stopped, I felt lighter by a weight I hadn't known. I was carrying until it was gone. Whatever was in those woods, whatever had watched me with its patient, evaluating gaze through 2 nights of darkness and snow, had taken something. Not from my body, not from my memory, not from the facts of my life. It had taken the armor I'd built around the facts, the administrative distance I'd placed between myself and my own experience. I didn't understand it. I still don't entirely. I'm a practical person, a project manager by trade, a person who lives by measurable outcomes. I have no framework for what I encountered on Harrow's spine, and I've stopped trying to build one. Some things are better held as questions. Whoa, weeks after coming home, I opened the journal I'd brought on the trip and wrote in it. For the first time since that first night, I wrote for 2 hours. The whole thing, the eyes in the hemlock grove, the shape at the ravine, the night without footprints, Ranger Calloway and her coffee, and the word evaluative, what it meant in the context of a man who had come to the wilderness to be efficient about sadness. I wrote it all without stopping, without editing, without the careful managed distance I usually placed between myself and the things I felt at the end. I wrote this. Something in the trees saw me. Not the version of me I'd been performing since November, the functional one, the capable one, the one who had forms filed and mediators scheduled in a very reasonable studio apartment. It saw the other version, the one I'd been trying to outrun by climbing a mountain in the snow, and it didn't judge what it saw. It just looked. With that absolute, patient attention that doesn't require anything from you except honesty about what you are. I wonder if that's the hardest thing of all. Not being watched. Being seen, there's a difference. Being watched means someone's eyes are on you. Being seen means something has understood what those eyes found. I've spent a long time managing what people watch. Managing my image, my output, my emotional presentation. I am very good at being watched and very bad at being seen. Something in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. In a February snowstorm, with no footprints and 2 points of steady light in the dark, something saw me, and I walked out of those woods carrying less than I walked in with. I think that was the point. I think that was the whole point. It is now October. The leaves are turning on the mountains visible from my apartment window, and the air has that particular bite that means the season is ending. I am sitting at my kitchen table with the journal open in front of me, and I have been asked by a friend who heard pieces of this story to write it all down properly, to give it a shape someone else can read. So here it is. I should tell you what's changed, because otherwise this is just a scary story without a reason for its telling. I left the project management firm in April. Not dramatically, I gave proper notice. Finished my current projects, left everything in good order. I'd been there for 7 years and it had been the right place for a long time, but I understood after February that I had been using work as the same kind of armor I'd been using efficiency. A way to be seen doing things without being seen being anything. I took 3 months to figure out what came next. Brent thought I was having a breakdown. My sister Meg, who has always understood me better, said I sounded like someone who had finally woken up. I'm teaching now. Environmental education at a middle school in a district just east of Asheville. I take kids into the woods on field trips, and I teach them how to read a topographic map and identify a bird by its call and move through wild space with attention rather than anxiety. I tell them the forest is worth listening to. I tell them that being alone in nature isn't something to manage or endure, but something to genuinely experience. I don't tell them about the eyes. Not yet. Maybe when they're older. Last month, one of my students, a quiet 12-year-old named Delia who notices everything, stopped in the middle of a trail and said, "Mr. Hurst, I have the feeling someone's watching us." I crouched beside her and looked at the tree line. The old mixed hardwood forest of the Pisgah foothills, familiar now and friendlier than February. Nothing visible between the trees except shadow and the russet of fallen leaves. "That feeling is real," I told her. "Your nervous system is picking up on information your conscious mind hasn't processed yet. The forest is full of things that watch animals that are aware of us long before we're aware of them. Deer, hawks, foxes. Even the trees respond to our presence in ways science is only beginning to understand." "Is it scary?" she asked. I thought about it honestly. "Only if you're not ready to be seen," I said. "If you go into the woods carrying something you're not willing to look at, yourself, something you're hiding from, the forest has a way of finding it. But if you go in honestly, without pretending," I looked at the tree line again, "then being watched doesn't feel like a threat. It feels like being acknowledged." Delia considered this with the gravity that 12-year-olds bring to things that matter. I think I'd like to be acknowledged, she said. Me too, I said. Me too. We kept walking. I have been back to the Pisgah National Forest 6 times since February. Not to the Harrow Spine section, not yet. Maybe someday, when I've earned it. But to the broader territory, to other trails, with other people, and alone, I have not seen the eyes again, but sometimes. In the deep sections of forest where the trees are old and the canopy is thick and the light changes, quality, sometimes I get the feeling. That particular awareness of being observed with the absolute. Patient attention of something that has been in those trees since before the roads were built and the trails were blazed. And the humans arrived with their maps and their problems. When it comes, I stop walking. I stand still. I look at the space between the trees and I say, out loud, into the quiet, I see you too. I don't know if it hears me. I don't know if hearing, in the way I mean it, applies, but I know something hears. Because after I say it, the feeling shifts from the primal discomfort of being watched without consenting to it, into something quieter. Something almost like recognition, like 2 things acknowledging each. Across a very old distance. Like hello, the forest is full of eyes. It always has been. Long before we walked into it with our grief and our efficiency, and our need for solitude that we hadn't fully earned. Long before we arrived with our headlamps and our freeze-dried meals and our compasses and our carefully managed hearts. The eyes were, they're patient, and I have learned, at significant cost and significant gain, that the only honest response to being seen is to look back end.